When a company fails, it does not fire their employees. It goes through a packaged bankruptcy, right? If anything, what happens is the people who have the pensions inside those companies, the employees of these companies, end up owning more of the company. The people that get wiped out are the speculators that own the unsecured tranches of debt, or the folks that own the equity. And by the way, those are the rules of the game. That's right, because these are the people that purport to be the most sophisticated investors in the world. They deserve to get wiped out. But the employees don't get wiped out.
That moment has gone viral as a summation of a lot of what's wrong with our economy and what the crisis response should be. The man being interviewed was Chamath Palihapitiya. He's the CEO of Social Capital. If you look at this chart of U.S. financial assets that he recently tweeted out, you can see why he's advocating for billionaires and millionaires to get financially wiped out, or at least some of them. He joins me now via Skype to explain. Chamath, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Tell us a little bit about the inspiration, I guess, of that segment, because so many, millions were really inspired by what you had to say as they look at the mismatch of how Congress is responding to this crisis and perhaps how we should think about our financial system as we go forward.
Well, I think the setup is important. So I have been lucky enough over the last 10 years to have invested billions of dollars in private companies trying to improve healthcare, education, climate change, space exploration. And so a lot of my comments come from the perspective of somebody who is invested in many, many small businesses trying to be well-run, living by the rules and living within the strict guardrails that are defined for us as we try to become successful. And against that backdrop, what I can tell you is that it is very difficult for us to know with any certainty how these stimulus dollars can actually positively affect us. So for good, well-run businesses that were being well-run before this crisis, the ability to know that you'll be able to keep your employees on or that you'll be able to fund what you need is very challenged. That being said, the worst-run companies, the ones that have the most insecure balance sheets, the ones that have been the most poorly run, the ones that have had the most profligate, CEO compensation packages and dysfunctional boards, are the first being rewarded in, frankly, the simplest and easiest ways. And so the setup is very unfair. The companies that are actually doing the work on the ground, the private businesses, or even the public ones that have been trying to do the right thing for years to save for a rainy day, aren't getting nearly as much help as the ones that can yell the loudest and or necessarily are the most dysfunctional. And in that, I think both capitalists and progressives have a lot to complain about. And that's sort of the genesis of my commentary.
Yeah, I think that's such a fundamental insight. And what is it about the airline industry in particular that you're looking at there that you were talking about in terms of bankruptcy and how workers can come out of that actually okay, and that much of this bailout, so much of the money is going to possibly the kind of the worst within our financial system? What is it about that structure that speaks to a broader thing in our economy?
Well, Scott Wapner, the host, brought up airlines as an example. But if you look at that thread and you pull the string, in the last 2 decades, the airlines have declared bankruptcy, I think, about 66 times. So, a couple times a year, 3 times a year. And they still exist and they're still around. At the same time, what you have is that most of the free cash flow dollars that they generated, so the things that you and I would call our savings, the things that we should be putting into our individual bank accounts for a rainy day, they didn't. And they essentially distributed that back to the board, the CEOs, and the hedge funds that were the largest proponents of that activity. And so they're in many ways a great example of not being prepared for exogenous shocks, yet being disproportionately rewarded. The reality is that when many of these airlines have gone through bankruptcy, all the jobs were largely preserved. Delta is a really interesting example. The last time they went and filed for bankruptcy, I think it was in 2012 or 13, they lost 157 jobs out of 55,000. They now employ 90,000 people. So bankruptcies are actually a structured way for companies to be able to reasonably discharge debt. Now, that disproportionately affects sophisticated investors, but it doesn't necessarily, and usually doesn't, disproportionately affect employees or pensions. And so, my whole idea is you have to let capitalism, and this is where progressives and capitalists can agree, you have to let capitalism do its job in moments like this, because the amount of money that we're printing into the system is so unbelievable. Sagar, just to give you an example, we have now printed more than $12 trillion into the economy. Just to give you a sense of what that means that we could have given every single person in the United States their entire 2019 wages and paid off everybody's student debt and still had $5 trillion for companies.
Right.
That's what we've done in the last 4 weeks.
And yet, right, go ahead.
No, I'm saying, and so when you're acting at that level of scale, there are going to be consequences. And those consequences, unfortunately, are going to yield its head in the form of inflation down the line. It probably means that the folks that are going to get the bailout money, who frankly only had to commit to not firing people until September, will unfortunately probably just wait till October and then just do it then. And so it doesn't necessarily put these companies in a better position to thrive in the medium and long term. And that will disproportionately negatively affect employees and pensioners.
I think this is the most important point that you're making here. And I think one of the reasons that the rant kind of went viral was that it was somebody kind of your ilk, traditionally thought of in the business community, an investor, saying, let these things get wiped out. How is that reconciled, I guess? I mean, was there a backlash against you in the business community? Or maybe do you represent, a newer way of thinking about American business?
No, I just think that I think a lot of people believe that capitalism is best when it's left to run as a meritocracy. Otherwise, you only have two paths. When capitalism veers off the tracks, it becomes crony capitalism or it becomes a kleptocracy or both. And I don't think we want that in America. And so for capitalism to do its job in a moment like this, you have to allow a more compassionate view of all of the people that are really being affected. And the employee-centric view would be one that says, let folks who understand the balance sheets of these businesses step in, save them, restructure them, and allow them to be better positioned in the future with better guardrails on things like CEO comp or things like buybacks. But if you allow the Fed, specifically in this case, to obfuscate how poorly run these businesses are, then they are going to fail, but just at a later point in time. And the damage will be that much more severe because the amount of capital that they've consumed between now and then is just going to grow. And I think that's the train wreck that I think that we can avoid as a society in the United States. And along with that, there should be an acknowledgement of the obvious, which is that the United States since World War II has been a consumer-led economy. Meaning every individual U.S. taxpayer and citizen has been the one that's driven this country to the forefront of all countries. And if we look at where people are losing revenue, yes, companies are losing revenue, but individuals are losing their own salary and wages at equal or disproportionately larger rates. And so if you can complement capitalism in the capital markets with compassion in the social policy that we employ by putting more money into folks' hands and thinking about, retiring debt or protecting debt levels of individuals as well as just companies. For example, like if the Fed is going to buy the junk debt of companies, there is no reason why they can't retire the $1.4 trillion of debt sitting at the DOE. It's just the decision.
Right. No, you're exactly. This is all just a matter of political will and what society puts its political will towards in a time of crisis. And, I think it would be a lot better off if there were more people and titans of American business like yourself that thought this way. Really appreciate you joining us, Chamath. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thanks again.
Of course. All right. We'll have more Rising for you after this.